In this video, I'm going to be speaking about Dividend Monarch ETFs and Dividend Aristocrat ETFs, and whether or not these ETFs are better than more conventional ETFs like VYM or VIG. And the ETFs here that I'm going to be comparing is the ETF KNGS, which is Kings, you could call it, which is a Dividend Monarch ETF, and a Dividend Monarch is a dividend company that has a record of paying dividends and increase them for the past 50 years. And the other ETF is NOBL or NOBL. This is the S&P 500 Dividend Aristocrats ETF. And a Dividend Aristocrat is a company that has increased its dividend over 25 consecutive years. And if you do enjoy content like this, please like and subscribe for future content. Now, the Dividend Monarch ETF KNGS hasn't been around for such a long time, and this video came from a subscriber idea. He recently purchased this ETF and wanted my opinion about it. So the ETF's investment methodology is pretty simple. It is the only ETF to invest in Dividend Monarchs, an elite group of over 30 companies with a 50-plus year of increasing dividends. And most of these companies are going to be among the most well-known and established companies in their respective industries. So all of these companies have been around for a really long time, and during that time have all increased their dividends. Now, this is a very small ETF by assets under management. The fund page says that it has about 3 million in assets under management. So that is very small when it comes to ETFs. Usually when we speak about these large ETFs like SCHD, VYM, VIG, we're talking in the billions. So this ETF really isn't even 1,000 of that size. An expense ratio of 0.35 and shares outstanding of only 110,000. We get a number of holdings of 40, so quite a few holdings in there overall. And the Dividend Aristocrat ETF NOBL is pretty much the same. Expense ratio of 0.35, quite a bit larger overall as a fund. And there are 67 companies that it has, and it currently pays a dividend yield of 2.75. And the Dividend Monarchs ETF has a dividend yield of 3.41. So I'm going to focus more so on the Dividend Monarchs because really when you look at it, the Dividend Monarchs are a subset of the Dividend Aristocrats. And what you'll find is a lot of these Dividend Monarchs will be included with those Aristocrats, with most doing so that is increasing dividends for 40 or more years. So the holdings will overlap a bit, but the holdings of the Dividend Monarch ETF are going to be a little bit more narrowed down with 40 holdings instead of NOBL's 67. Let's look at the top 10 holdings of the Kings ETF. Some of these stocks you definitely heard of, like 3M, and AbbVie, Kimberly-Clark, Hormel Foods, and Target. Others may or may not be so well known, but they have all been around for a very long time in their own right. And like the ETF said, a lot of these stocks, these companies are leaders in their respective industries because they've been around for so long and are so well developed. And when I first heard of this ETF and the ETF NOBL, whether it be the Dividend Monarchs ETF or the Dividend Aristocrats ETF, I was kind of wondering why each of these aren't so popular among dividend investors. If investors like dividends, why not pick the companies with the longest track record of growing their dividends, of course, which are the Dividend Monarchs, or Dividend Aristocrats, which have grown their dividends for over 25 years. Why aren't these ETFs so popular compared to more conventional ETFs? Now, this Dividend Monarch ETF Kings hasn't been around for such a long time, so there isn't much historical performance we can go by. It is relatively new again. It has only been around for about 3 or 4 years, so we can't really go back that far. However, what we can do is we can look at the index that this ETF tracks, and that is the S&P Dividend Monarchs Index. So this index is basically where that ETF gets its investment methodology from. And this index has been around for a little bit longer, so we can look at the historical performance of this index and kind of see how this Dividend Monarch ETF would have performed. Now, this index hasn't been around for 10 years, so we're going to use 5 years as the historical backtest that we're going to look at. And we are going to see that this ETF has a total return of about 7% annualized. So that is going to be with dividends reinvested. Overall, not a bad amount. Of course, this is growing over time, as you can see. Now I think we're going to really get into why these ETFs aren't so popular overall. So I just showed you the Kings ETF, and now I'm going to show you NOBL, which is a step down. So these are companies that have a 25-year history of increasing their dividends. And this ETF tracks the S&P 500 Dividend Aristocrats Index. Scrolling down a bit, you are going to see that this ETF has a higher 5-year annualized return. It has about a 10.5% annualized return, whereas the Dividend Monarch ETF had a 7.03% annualized return. So you would think that the Kings ETF that selects stocks that have a longer history of increasing their dividend would have performed better, because you would think that those would be the more quality companies. But that's just not the case. You'd see that the Dividend Aristocrats Index performed quite a bit better overall. And when it comes to specifically dividend growth or dividend appreciation, those ETFs, of course, focus on companies that have a history of increasing their dividends, whether it be over the past 25 years or 50 years. But there's another ETF, an ETF that I invest in, and which is the most popular dividend ETF there is, the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF. And this ETF seeks to track the performance of the S&P US Dividend Growers Index. And this ETF selects stocks that have a policy of consistently increasing their dividends every year for at least 10 consecutive years. But then the index excludes the top 25 highest yielding eligible companies from the index. So this is going to select stocks that, like the other ETFs, NOBL and Kings, have a history of increasing their dividends, but they are going to exclude those really high dividend yielding companies. And when you do exclude those high yielding companies while also still focusing on growing dividends over 10 years, you see that you have a annualized return of about 13.28% over those past 5 years. And remember, just bringing back the dividend monarchs, those are the companies that increase their dividends for 50 years. This only has a 7% return roughly. So you see with the Dividend Growers Index, it outperformed that Dividend Kings Index or the Dividend Monarchs Index by quite a bit, about 6% annualized. So far exceeded the annualized average return of those seemingly great companies that have a long track record of increasing their dividends. Now, I think the seasoned dividend investors know that the ETF VIG doesn't really have that high of a dividend yield, and the dividend index for the monarchs completely blow away the yield of the Dividend Growers Index. So we see that this blows it away. So if you're a dividend investor and you want yield, you'd say, well, I don't really care if that ETF performs so much better. I'm doing it for yield. But there is another ETF that we can look at that does focus on high yields. And this is also another very popular ETF, VYM, the Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF. And this ETF seeks to track the performance of the FTSE High Dividend Yield Index. And this ETF has a relatively similar dividend yield as the Kings Index. This is the 30-day SEC yield, so this calculates a little bit differently, but overall, VYM is in the ballpark of around 3% to 3.5% overall. And if we look at the historical performance over the past 5 years of the FTSE High Yield Dividend Index, remember that is the index that VYM tracks, we see a 5-year return, total return of 11% annually. And remember that Dividend Monarch Index had an annualized return of 7%. So overall, VYM, the ETF that tracks that high yield index, outperformed the Dividend Monarch Index by quite a bit, and it also has a relatively similar dividend yield. And remember that Monarch ETF Kings had a pretty high expense ratio of 0.35% compared to VYM's of 0.06%. And when you look at this ETF, there are going to be quite a few more holdings overall, with this one having a 449 holdings compared to the Kings ETF, which has about 40. So VYM, similar dividend yield, better returns over time, and far more diversified. So I think if you look at Kings and the Aristocrats, why would you pick that when you can pick an ETF like VYM, VIG, and get a better return and pay lower fees and also have more diversity? But anyway, why does this happen? Why do these ETFs that have such a, great investment methodology tracking these companies with a record of increasing their dividends over time, why do these ETFs fail? So I basically tried to figure this out. Now, when you look at the top holdings of this ETF, again, they're all, well-established companies. But if you look at their performance, you see over the past 5 years that 3M did pretty terrible. It's down over 50%. And its yield, even though it is quite high, it doesn't really make up for that with its destruction in share price over that time. And we see something similar with the next largest holding, Black Hills Corp, in that ETF. The share price has just declined almost 30% over that time, and its dividend yield is still quite high. So you have these two companies sitting at the top that comprise nearly 10% of the fund's overall holdings that just did awful in capital appreciation during that time. Now, just because a stock yields high and a stock has a history of growing its dividends, it doesn't really mean that it's quality. And this is probably why the Dividend Growers Index, the index that VIG tracks, excludes those top 25% of the highest dividend yielding eligible companies. So those two holdings that I just showed you that decreased in price so much, that's not going to be included in VIG, which is going to basically hinder the capital appreciation of the ETF. And when we look at the top holding of Kings, so this is the Dividend Monarchs ETF, I have to ask, would you rather own this for dividends or would you rather own these stocks for dividends? Now, this is, again, VYM, and I think that VYM, again, has quite a bit more diversity. The better companies are at the top. Again, this ETF has a lower expense ratio, and it has more annualized return on average overall. So I just hope I gave you an idea of why those Dividend Aristocrats and Dividend Monarch ETFs don't really perform as well. Again, that Dividend Monarch ETF did grow 7% annualized over the past 5 years, so I don't think it's going to do awful. I don't think you're going to lose all of your money over time, but why not go with an ETF that has a better investment methodology, that has performed better, and that is cheaper overall? So I hope that gave you an idea of maybe why those ETFs like Dividend Monarchs and Dividend Aristocrats don't do so well compared to the more conventional ETF. And I will see you all in the next video.